My name is Holly Bergstrom, and for 11 months, I believed my neighbor Carol hated my dog. She called animal control on him 14 times. For barking, for being aggressive at the fence, for once, memorably, looking at her cat with intent. I installed a camera specifically to catch whatever was setting him off each time an officer showed up at my door with another complaint on their clipboard. What that camera actually caught, 4 months in, wasn't my dog doing anything wrong at all. It was Carol, at 6 a.m. most mornings, in her bathrobe, climbing over the low spot in our shared fence, with a Tupperware container of leftover pot roast, feeding my dog by hand while whispering something to him I couldn't make out until I finally turned up the audio. This is the story of the most confusing, infuriating, and ultimately kind of hilarious neighbor dispute of my life, and the surveillance footage that finally explained why my sweet, lazy golden retriever had somehow become the most reported dog in county animal control history. Welcome back to True Family Drama, the channel for real stories of betrayal, justice, and, every once in a while, a mystery that turns out to have a stranger explanation than anyone expected. This one's a little different from most of what you've seen on this channel. Nobody forged a signature, nobody stole an inheritance. But by the end of this story, you're going to understand exactly why 14 animal control visits in 1 year drove me to the edge of sanity, and why the actual explanation left me somewhere between furious and unable to stop laughing. If you're new here, subscribe, because there's a lot more like this waiting for you. To understand how a Tupperware container of pot roast ended up being the center of an entire year of my life, you have to understand my dog first, because Baxter is, by every honest account, the least aggressive creature I have ever met, which is exactly what made this whole ordeal so genuinely baffling from the very beginning. I adopted Baxter 4 years ago from a golden retriever rescue 2 counties over, a 5-year-old dog surrendered by an elderly owner who could no longer manage his exercise needs. And from the very first afternoon I brought him home, he displayed exactly one personality trait with any real consistency: an overwhelming, almost comedic desire to be loved by literally every living creature he encountered, including the mail carrier, the UPS driver, 3 separate stray cats in the neighborhood, and, on one memorable occasion, a raccoon that wandered into our yard at dusk, and that Baxter attempted to befriend with the same enthusiastic tail wagging he offered everyone else, resulting in a slightly undignified retreat once the raccoon made its feelings about the encounter clear. He's never bitten anyone. He's never so much as growled at another dog in the 4 years I've owned him. His idea of guarding the house consists of alerting me with great excitement to the presence of a squirrel, and then immediately losing interest once the squirrel is no longer visible. I moved into my current house, a small ranch-style place on a quiet cul-de-sac outside Sacramento, about 18 months before any of this started, and Carol Whitfield, no relation to any Whitfields from earlier stories on this channel, apparently just a popular last name in my orbit, had lived next door for over a decade by that point, a widow in her late 60s who kept almost entirely to herself, exchanging little more than the occasional wave when we happened to be getting our mail at the same time. I want to describe my earliest impressions of the neighborhood more broadly, because I think the contrast between how quiet and unremarkable everything seemed at first, and how genuinely stressful the following year, became matters to the overall shape of this story. The cul-de-sac itself is the kind of place realtors describe as established: modest ranch homes built in the 70s, mature trees, the specific unhurried rhythm of a neighborhood where most residents have lived for decades rather than years. I'd moved there specifically for that quiet, coming from a downtown apartment where Baxter's exercise needs had felt increasingly difficult to meet, and I remember feeling, in those first few months, a genuine sense of relief at having found a place that felt settled, safe, exactly the kind of environment I wanted for a dog entering what I assumed would be the calmest years of his life. I want you to hold on to that sense of relief as a contrast, because it makes the eventual year of anxiety and animal control visits feel even more disorienting in retrospect. I had chosen this specific quiet cul-de-sac precisely to avoid the kind of stress that ended up defining nearly a full year of my life there instead. I want to be honest that my initial impression of Carol was almost entirely neutral, bordering on positive. She kept an immaculate garden, always waved politely, and gave no indication whatsoever, in our first several months as neighbors, of harboring any particular feelings about my dog, one way or another. The first call from animal control came about 7 months after I moved in. On a Tuesday afternoon in April, an officer named Deputy Ruiz arriving at my door to inform me that a neighbor had reported excessive barking and aggressive behavior at the property line. I was, understandably, confused, since Baxter had been inside the house napping for most of that afternoon, a fact I explained to Deputy Ruiz, along with genuine bewilderment about what he could possibly have been reported for. Deputy Ruiz, to his credit, was polite and clearly skeptical himself, noting that the complaint hadn't specified a time and that, absent any evidence of an actual incident, he had no basis to issue any citation. He left with a simple verbal warning logged in the system. The kind of thing I assumed at the time was a strange one-off misunderstanding. It was not a one-off misunderstanding. Over the following 11 months, I received, by my own careful count once I started tracking it, 14 separate animal control visits, each one triggered by a complaint that, as far as I could ever determine, had originated from Carol's address, though the county's confidentiality policy around complainant identity meant I couldn't confirm this with absolute certainty until much later in this story. The complaints varied in specificity and, frankly, in plausibility. Barking at 2 a.m. on nights I could personally confirm Baxter had been sleeping soundly in my bedroom. Aggressive lunging at the shared fence line on days I'd been at work with Baxter safely in his crate. And, my personal favorite, a complaint describing him as having stared menacingly at Carol's elderly cat, Whiskers, a claim I found almost impossible to take seriously given that Baxter's actual reaction to any animal, cat included, has never once in 4 years exceeded enthusiastic, slightly desperate friendliness. I want to describe the specific toll these repeated visits took on me over that year, because I think it matters to understanding how genuinely destabilizing this entire situation became long before I ever discovered the actual explanation. I want to be specific about how this affected my daily life, because I think the abstract phrase took a toll undersells exactly how consuming it became. I started keeping a written log of Baxter's whereabouts, time-stamped, cross-referenced against my own work calendar, a habit that felt, looking back, almost obsessive, but that felt, at the time, like the only rational response to a pattern of complaints I couldn't otherwise explain. I began dreading the specific sound of a car slowing down in front of my house, my stomach tightening every single time, unable to tell whether it was simply someone turning around in the cul-de-sac or another animal control visit about to unfold. I stopped leaving Baxter in the backyard, unsupervised for any length of time, even briefly, worried that whatever was triggering these complaints might escalate if he was ever out there without me present to witness and document his actual behavior directly. My sister, visiting for a weekend about 9 months into this pattern, told me, gently, but with real concern, that I seemed wound tighter than I've ever seen you. A comment that landed harder than she probably intended, because I recognized, hearing it, exactly how much space this unexplained mystery had come to occupy in my life. Each animal control visit required me to take time off work, to document Baxter's whereabouts and behavior with increasing paranoid thoroughness, and to sit through a growing, accumulating fear that, regardless of how baseless each individual complaint seemed, 14 reports in a single county system was starting to build a file that could, eventually, if it continued, result in real consequences, a formal hearing, a designation as a dangerous dog. Even in the worst case scenarios, I found myself lying awake worrying about some kind of order requiring Baxter's removal from the neighborhood entirely. I loved that dog more than I'd loved almost anything in my adult life, and the growing, accumulating weight of a paper trail I couldn't understand, generated by complaints that bore no resemblance to my dog's actual behavior, genuinely began to affect my sleep, my mood, and, if I'm honest, my ability to trust that my own neighborhood was a safe, stable place to be raising a pet I adored. I approached Carol directly about 3 months into this pattern. After the fifth or sixth visit, standing at the shared fence line one Saturday morning as calmly as I could manage, asking her plainly whether she'd noticed anything about Baxter's behavior that concerned her, since I genuinely wanted to address any legitimate issue if one actually existed. I want to describe that first fence line conversation in a bit more detail because I've replayed it many times since learning the truth, and small details I dismissed at the time now read very differently. I remember she was wearing gardening gloves, holding a small trowel, and that her hands, I now realize, were shaking slightly the entire time we spoke. Something I attributed at the time to the cool morning air, rather than to what I now understand was genuine anxiety about being confronted directly. She kept glancing toward Baxter, who was lying contentedly in the grass a few feet away, with an expression I misread, at the time, as wariness, and that I now recognize, watching the memory play back in my mind with new context, as something closer to tenderness she was actively suppressing in front of me. Carol's response, in retrospect, should have struck me as considerably stranger than it did at the time. She seemed almost flustered by the question, told me she hadn't noticed anything in particular, and quickly changed the subject to ask how my tomato plants were doing that season. A pivot so abrupt and so unrelated to the actual conversation that I remember feeling, even then, a vague, unplaceable sense that something about the exchange didn't quite add up. I didn't push further. I chalked her evasiveness up to social awkwardness, or perhaps embarrassment about having been the one filing complaints, and went back inside more confused than reassured. I want to walk you through the specific escalating absurdity of the final few complaints before I explain how I finally uncovered what was actually happening, because I think the sheer implausibility of some of them matters to the eventual reveal. I want to mention a few more of the complaints from the middle of that year, because their sheer creative variety, in retrospect, should probably have tipped me off sooner that something stranger than simple neighborly hostility was going on. The eighth complaint alleged Baxter had chased a jogger aggressively down the sidewalk, a claim I found nearly impossible to reconcile with a dog who, on the one occasion I actually witnessed him encounter a jogger directly, responded by flopping onto his back in the middle of the sidewalk in an unmistakable, if inconveniently timed, request for belly rubs. The 10th complaint described excessive nighttime howling, despite the fact that Baxter, in 4 years, has never once howled at anything, a behavioral quirk I might have found almost impressive in a golden retriever, if it hadn't been used, apparently, as fabricated evidence against him. Each complaint, read individually, might have seemed like an honest, if mistaken, report from a genuinely concerned neighbor. Read together, accumulating across nearly a year, they began to take on a strange, almost theatrical quality, as though whoever was filing them was working from an internal checklist of stereotypical bad dog behaviors rather than describing anything Baxter had actually, verifiably done. The 12th complaint alleged that Baxter had been digging aggressively at the base of the shared fence in an apparent attempt to breach it, a claim that puzzled me enormously at the time, since Baxter, a dog with the energy level of a very content houseplant, had never shown the slightest interest in digging anywhere in the 4 years I'd owned him. The 13th complaint described him as having been unsupervised and roaming in the early morning hours, which struck me as similarly implausible since Baxter's entire morning routine consisted of a brief, leashed bathroom trip before returning inside for what I can only describe as several more hours of enthusiastic napping. The 14th and final complaint, filed in early March, roughly 11 months after the first, finally pushed me to a decision I probably should have made much earlier. Installing a home security camera specifically angled to capture the shared fence line and the section of yard where Baxter spent most of his outdoor time, both to document his actual behavior for my own protection and, frankly, to finally get some clarity about what was actually happening during whatever incidents were supposedly triggering these repeated reports. I want to describe the first several weeks of camera footage because they were, initially, almost aggressively unremarkable, which was, in its own way, reassuring. Hours upon hours of Baxter doing exactly what I'd always known him to do, lying in the sun, occasionally chasing a butterfly with more enthusiasm than the butterfly's actual threat level warranted, barking briefly and unremarkably at the mail carrier before immediately wagging his tail in apparent apology. Nothing in those first weeks came remotely close to explaining 14 months of escalating complaints. Then, about a month into having the camera installed, I noticed something reviewing the footage on a Sunday morning that stopped me completely. Time-stamped at 6:04 a.m., well before I typically woke up myself, the footage showed Carol, in a pale blue bathrobe, moving carefully along her side of the shared fence line, glancing back toward her own house repeatedly in a manner that read, unmistakably, as someone checking whether she was being observed. She approached a specific low section of the fence, one where an old, slightly warped board had created a gap just wide enough for a small animal, or, apparently, a determined 60-something-year-old woman in a bathrobe, to climb through with some effort. She carried in one hand a Tupperware container. Baxter, who had apparently been waiting for her, appeared at the fence with an enthusiasm that, watching the footage, made my stomach do something complicated, somewhere between confusion and a dawning, disbelieving realization. Carol knelt down, opened the container, and began hand-feeding Baxter what I would later identify, on a subsequent morning's footage, as pieces of pot roast, speaking to him in a low, warm voice throughout, a voice utterly unlike the flustered, evasive tone she'd used with me at the fence months earlier. I turned up the camera's audio, straining to hear what she was actually saying, and caught fragments across several minutes of footage. "There's my good boy. Did you miss me?" And most tellingly, a line that finally, fully cracked open the entire mystery I'd been living inside for nearly a year. "Don't tell your mama I spoil you so much. This is our secret, isn't it, sweetheart?" I want to describe sitting at my kitchen table watching that footage for the first time, because the emotional whiplash of it is honestly difficult to fully convey. My first reaction was pure, disbelieving confusion. Why would a woman secretly, tenderly feeding my dog homemade pot roast at dawn also be the person filing repeated false complaints, attempting to get that same dog reported to animal control? The two behaviors seemed, on their face, to belong to two entirely different people, and for a genuinely disorienting few minutes, I found myself wondering whether I'd somehow misidentified the source of the complaints entirely, whether some other neighbor I hadn't considered might actually be responsible while Carol's secret feeding sessions were simply an unrelated, if deeply strange, coincidence. I decided at that point that I needed actual answers rather than continued speculation, and I made the decision to approach Carol directly, footage in hand, rather than immediately escalating to animal control or the county to formally identify her as the complainant. I want to explain that choice because I think it reflects something important about how I wanted to handle this situation once I understood there was clearly something more complicated happening than simple neighborly hostility. Whatever was going on, the tenderness in that footage, the specific private warmth in her voice, told me this wasn't a woman who actually disliked my dog. Something else was happening, something I needed to understand before deciding how angry I actually had a right to be. I caught Carol in her own driveway on a Wednesday evening, footage saved on my phone, and asked, as gently as I could manage while still being direct, whether we could talk. I want to describe her face when I mention the security camera footage, because the specific rapid collapse of her composure told me, immediately, that whatever explanation was coming, it had been building under the surface for a long time, waiting, perhaps even wanting, to finally be discovered. What came out, over nearly 2 hours, sitting on her back porch that evening, drinking tea she made with hands that shook slightly throughout the entire conversation, was a story I hadn't remotely anticipated, and that reframed almost everything I thought I understood about the past year. Carol's husband, Walter, had died 3 years before I moved in next door, after a marriage of nearly 40 years, and the couple had, for the last decade of Walter's life, owned a golden retriever named Duke, a dog Carol described, through tears that started almost as soon as she began telling me about him, as the only thing that made the house feel less empty after the kids moved out. Duke had died of old age about 8 months before I adopted Baxter, and Carol told me, with a rawness that made clear this grief had never actually been processed, only buried under the ordinary demands of continuing to live alone in a house that had once held a husband, then a beloved dog, and now held only her. When I moved in with Baxter, a golden retriever who, Carol told me, looked so much like Duke it took my breath away the first time I saw him over the fence. Something in her, she explained, had reawakened a grief she'd never fully allowed herself to feel, tangled together with something she was clearly embarrassed to admit even now, sitting across from me on her own porch. A desperate, complicated longing to have a dog like Duke back in her life again, without the terrifying vulnerability of actually adopting one herself, at her age, alone, uncertain whether she had it in her to survive that particular kind of loss a second time. I want to describe what Carol told me next carefully, because I think it's the emotional core of this entire strange story. She told me that she'd started, almost accidentally, leaving small amounts of food near the fence line within the first few weeks of my moving in, not fully articulated even to herself as a plan, simply an impulse she gave into one afternoon, and then found herself unable to stop repeating. Baxter, being Baxter, had responded to her presence and her food with exactly the same overwhelming friendliness he offered everyone, and Carol, starved for exactly that specific kind of uncomplicated canine affection, found herself increasingly drawn into a secret daily ritual, feeding him, talking to him, experiencing, for a few stolen minutes each morning, something that felt, she told me, like having Duke back, just a little bit, just enough to get through the day. The animal control complaints, she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper by this point in the conversation, had started for a reason that took me a genuinely long moment to fully process once she explained it. She had grown, over the months of secret morning visits, increasingly and irrationally afraid that I would somehow discover what she was doing, feeding my dog food I hadn't approved, potentially something that could make him sick, trespassing on my property in a way she knew, rationally, was inappropriate no matter how innocent her intentions felt to her. Rather than confronting that fear directly, or simply stopping the visits, or, as I pointed out to her later in our conversation, simply asking me if she could spend time with Baxter openly, Carol had convinced herself, in a spiral of anxiety she struggled to fully explain even to herself in retrospect, that the safest way to protect her secret was to establish, on the official record, a narrative in which Baxter was a problematic, poorly behaved dog, one whose behavior, if I ever did notice anything unusual, like an open gate or a missing piece of pot roast, could plausibly be attributed to his own troublesome tendencies rather than to her own secret visits. I told myself, she said, staring down at her tea rather than at me, that if there was already a file on him for being difficult and something ever seemed strange, like a gate left open, everyone would just assume it was him being difficult again. I know now how insane that sounds. I think some part of me knew it sounded insane while I was doing it too. I just couldn't stop myself once I'd started. I want to sit with the specific tragedy and absurdity of that explanation for a moment, because I think it captures something genuinely poignant underneath what initially felt to me like pure harassment. Carol had constructed an elaborate, self defeating cover story specifically to protect a secret whose actual content, a grieving widow finding brief moments of comfort with a friendly dog, required no protection at all, would have been met had she simply asked me directly, with nothing but sympathy and an open invitation to visit Baxter whenever she wanted. Instead, isolated in a grief she'd never fully processed and a loneliness she seemed almost unable to name directly. Even now, she'd built, complaint by complaint, an entire false narrative that had genuinely terrified me for nearly a year, all in service of protecting a secret that had never needed protecting in the first place. I want to describe my own emotional reaction sitting on that porch, because I think it's more complicated than a simple clean forgiveness, and I want to be honest about that complexity, rather than tie it up too neatly. Part of me, understandably I think, remained genuinely angry. 14 animal control visits is not a small thing, regardless of the underlying motivation, and the fear I'd carried for nearly a year about Baxter's safety and my own standing in the neighborhood was real, was exhausting, and deserved acknowledgement as a genuine harm even once I understood it hadn't come from actual malice. But another part of me, watching this composed, private woman cry on her own porch over a dog she'd lost and a husband she'd lost before that, found it almost impossible to hold on to that anger with any real force once I understood what had actually been driving it. I told Carol, as honestly as I could manage, that what she'd done had genuinely hurt me, had cost me real time, real stress, real fear about my dog's future in our neighborhood, and that regardless of her underlying loneliness, false complaints to animal control were not an acceptable way to manage that pain, a boundary I needed her to understand clearly before we could move forward into whatever came next between us. She agreed, immediately and fully, offering an apology that felt, unlike some of the manufactured explanations I've encountered in other stories on this channel, entirely genuine, without qualification or deflection. What we arrived at, over the following weeks, surprised me in its simplicity, and I think, honestly, in its rightness. Rather than simply ending the relationship between Carol and Baxter entirely, which felt, once I understood the full context, like an unnecessarily harsh response to what had ultimately been a grief-driven mistake rather than genuine cruelty, I invited her to visit him openly instead. Scheduled mornings, twice a week, where she could come over, sit in my kitchen, and spend real, unhidden time with a dog who, it turned out, had brought her more comfort over the past year than either of us had fully understood, until that porch conversation finally connected the pieces. I set clear boundaries around what she could and couldn't feed him, boundaries she's followed carefully and gratefully ever since. And I made clear that if she ever felt the impulse toward that kind of secretive, anxious behavior again, about anything, the door to simply talking to me directly was always open, far preferable to another year of animal control visits neither of us wanted to repeat. I want to describe what those visits have looked like in the years since, because I think it's the genuinely warm, unexpected ending to a story that started with so much stress and confusion. Carol comes over most Tuesday and Saturday mornings now, openly, through the front door, rather than over a broken fence board, and I've come to genuinely look forward to those mornings myself, watching a woman who spent over a year secretly, anxiously sneaking food to my dog, instead simply sit at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, laughing at Baxter's increasingly elaborate attempts to convince her he hasn't eaten in days, despite having just finished breakfast 20 minutes earlier. She's told me, more than once, that those mornings have become the highlight of her week, and I believe her completely, because I've watched, with my own eyes, the specific, visible lightness that settles into her whenever she walks through my door now, nothing at all like the flustered, evasive woman I once tried to talk to at a shared fence line. We fixed the broken fence board together, actually, a small, almost symbolic project that took us an entire Saturday afternoon and ended with both of us covered in sawdust, laughing more than either of us expected to over a task that had, only months earlier, represented the physical evidence of an entire year of secret anxiety and misdirected grief. Carol told me, standing back to admire our slightly uneven repair work, that fixing it together felt like closing something she hadn't realized she needed to close, and I understood, watching her say it, that she wasn't only talking about a fence. I want to mention one more development from the month since, because I think it rounds out this story in a way that feels genuinely important. About 6 months after our porch conversation, Carol mentioned, almost offhandedly during one of her Saturday morning visits, that she'd started looking into local rescue organizations, wondering aloud whether she might finally be ready to consider adopting a dog of her own, something she told me she hadn't felt capable of even considering since Duke died. I want to describe my own reaction to that comment because it surprised me with how emotional it made me. A genuine, unexpected pride in watching someone move, slowly and on her own timeline, from a place of such hidden, anxious grief towards something that looked, for the first time since I'd known her, like actual hope. I offered to go with her to the same rescue where I'd found Baxter, and 3 months later, Carol adopted a scruffy, middle-aged terrier mix named Pepper, a dog with considerably more energy and considerably less patience than Baxter, but one who has, by every account Carol gives me during our now regular visits, brought a specific, different kind of joy back into a house that had been far too quiet for far too long. Baxter and Pepper get along famously, as it turns out, spending long afternoons together in whichever yard happens to host that day's visit. And I've come to think of Carol's Saturday mornings at my kitchen table, now often accompanied by Pepper trotting in alongside her, as one of the more unexpectedly meaningful friendships to come out of this entire strange year. We talk now, openly, about Walter, about Duke, about the specific loneliness of a house that used to hold more people and more life than it currently does. Conversations that would have been unthinkable back when our entire relationship consisted of polite waves over a mailbox and, unbeknownst to me, increasingly elaborate false complaints filed to protect a secret that never should have needed protecting. I think about this entire ordeal now with a strange kind of fondness that surprises me, given how genuinely stressful and confusing it was to live through for nearly a year. Baxter, for his part, remains entirely unaware of the elaborate, anxious drama his own overwhelming friendliness inadvertently caused, continuing to greet Carol each visit with exactly the same enthusiastic, uncomplicated joy he offers literally everyone he meets, apparently uninterested in the fact that he was, for the better part of a year, the county's most falsely reported golden retriever. I've come to think there's something genuinely instructive in that simplicity, actually. That Baxter never once needed complicated explanations, elaborate cover stories, or secret morning visits to offer Carol exactly the comfort she was looking for. He simply needed to be himself, openly, the same way he'd been the entire time. And it took the rest of us considerably longer than it should have to figure out that the easiest, kindest path forward had been available from the very beginning. If only either of us had felt safe enough to ask directly, instead of constructing an entire secret, anxious architecture around a need that never should have needed hiding at all. That's my story. My neighbor filed 14 false animal control complaints against my perfectly harmless golden retriever, and it turned out she was the same woman secretly climbing the fence every morning to feed him pot roast, driven by a grief over her own dead dog and dead husband that she'd never found the words to name out loud until a security camera finally forced the truth into the open. If you've ever assumed the worst about someone's strange behavior, only to discover a far sadder, far more human explanation underneath it, I want you to hear this clearly. Not every mystery in your life is a betrayal waiting to be uncovered. Sometimes it's just loneliness, wearing a disguise it never actually needed, waiting for someone to simply ask, directly and kindly what's really going on. If this story made you laugh, or made you tear up, or somehow both, subscribe to True Family Drama. Tell me in the comments about the strangest neighbor mystery you've ever actually solved, and I'll see you in the next one.